Good morning, everyone. Happy Wednesday, August 14th. A couple quick reminders. We will be having class this afternoon from 1 to 3 o'clock. Just another rendition of what we've been doing the last couple Wednesdays. Every Wednesday, we're trying to do things a little bit different, bring a little bit of a different flair, different information. We talked about the buyer side. We talked about the seller side. We covered some role playing through some objections and scenarios. Today's class is going to be circumstantial and scenario related. So 1 to 3 o'clock, we'll be talking about specific scenarios that you might be in and how to handle them. We're going to have you giving some of those answers. We're going to do some question and answer with the group and team using Zoom. And then we will also be going into some objections and objection handlers as well. So today's class is going to be more interactive now that we've had 3 weeks, 3 weeks worth of classes. Today, you should have enough information and you should have enough knowledge and ability to be able to formulate responses and replies and to be able to deduce what should happen in the specific scenario. So this is going to be more integrated within you guys in the room and online. So please join us from 1 to 3. It'll be in the Apollo Beach office today, just because we had some technical difficulties with South Tampa. So it'll be in Apollo Beach, but also Zooms. So let's go ahead and start off. Today we're going to do some more Q&A because you guys we're sending out emails on Google Forms and you guys are replying, giving us questions that you want answered. So we are answering those questions. We're doing them live on here. We're calculating and putting them together into forms and creating different objections and scripts and things. And we're working on creating all of that, putting it all together, and then making sure it's available to you. We're really hoping to have all of this completed probably for this week, but that's what our focus is and our goal is. So let's go ahead and get started with today. All right, first off, we're seeing a lot of sellers receiving postcards, and they're getting the class action notice to people who own a home. And basically, they're sending them out to pretty much any homeowner. They're sending them out specifically to homes, and it's got the postcard and it says you may be a part of a class action lawsuit and you have the ability to enroll with this, to opt in, to opt out, or to do nothing. That's basically what their options are. A lot of sellers have gotten these already. Basically, this is the same way with any class action suit, whether there's been some with T-Mobile, there's been some with data breaches, there's been some with all kinds of different things. We've all received something. You may be a part of this class action suit that was here. Call this number, go to this website. You can opt in and get your payment. So realtors, Florida Realtors sent out an email. You all get these emails. They come from the Florida Realtors, Florida Realtor News, the first line, how to address class action notice questions. Basically, they're giving us a website. The website is www.realestatecommissionlitigation.com. People have questions, they can go to that. If they go to this site, it basically says, these are the selling parties. You do not have to have used one of these selling parties. Click here and you can go to file a claim, meaning opt in, give them the property address and file a claim for how much you paid, what you did, and if you sold a home. That opts them into the class action suit. That gives them the ability to be eligible for some type of payment. The last I heard, the payments were like less than $200 right now because of the size of the class that was there, even though the size of the suit was larger. Don't give any advice. Don't tell people they should or they shouldn't. Just let them know this is an option for them. You need to deem if it's something that you want to look into. So there's just 3 days left before the implementation of the National Association of Realtors practice changes on August 17th. Soon, sellers who qualify as members of class action lawsuit will receive a class notice from the court, and you may get questions. So it's basically telling them you have the ability to become a member of this class. In the case of Sitzer Burnett, members of the settlement class includes home sellers who sold a home during the eligible date ranges, which are in that website. Their home was sold on MLS anywhere in the United States, and they paid a commission to a real estate brokerage in connection with the sale of the home. That's it. Those are the 3 qualifications. You sold a home during the range, it was on the MLS, and you paid a commission. That's the only qualifications you need. You did not have to use any one of the specific realtors that were there. Class notice informs class members of their rights, options, and deadlines to exercise. They either opt in and they have the ability to get payment. They opt out, meaning they are not becoming a part of that class, which gives them the ability, if they deem fit, to try to file some suit at some other date, or they do nothing and the time frame passes and they have no rights or anything according to that. NAR doesn't manage the class notice process. Nevertheless, realtors may receive questions from consumers. NAR members should direct their consumers to this settlement website where they find relevant information. You may also direct them to call this number. NAR members should refrain from further advising the consumers on that notice. Very basic, very simple. So don't try to answer and explain too much. Just let them know that's why they got it, because there's three things. You sold a home during the date range, it was on MLS, and you paid a commission. You have eligibility to receive payment based on this class notice. So go to that website where you can file a claim and check into it. That's it. All right, so let's get into some of these questions that we have. So these are all new ones. We've had quite a few. We've probably had about 40 to 50 questions that have come up, and they continue, more and more come in every week. So some of them are scenario based. Some of them are pretty straightforward. So let's just start going through and reading through these and answering them so we can explain. Some of you are very creative with the way you like to word your questions, as number one is. So Ann and I were chatting and we came up with a scenario to see how this would be handled. Ann leaves for vacation. Bob and Sally are her clients, and she has an exclusive buyer brokerage agreement signed with Bob and Sally. Ann is in Spain drinking sangria when Bob and Sally text her because they found the home of their dreams and they want to see it tonight. So Ann, being in Spain, is not available to show them that home, but she does have an EBBA with them. Ann asks Gwen to show the home. Would Gwen need an EBBA signed, or is the one Ann signed sufficient, because technically it says broker at the top, not Ann Wilson, who is as who the agreement is with, and Gwen is also with C21. If you need more clarification, please email back. So agents in Florida, we are deemed to be a brokerage state. So the agreements, contracts are all with the brokerage. You are an authorized agent of the brokerage. Whenever a consumer signs an agreement with you as the authorized agent, they are signing an agreement with Century 21 Beggins, Century 21 BE3, Century 21 List with Beggins. So you do not need multiple EBBAs, exclusive buyer brokerage agreements, or any other representation agreement, as long as you all work within the same brokerage. So in this case, Ann has an exclusive buyer brokerage agreement with her buyer. The buyer signed the agreement with Century 21 Beggins. Any agent with Century 21 Beggins is allowed to show that property, and compensation would be due, because they are still working with Century 21 Beggins, just a different agent as the authorized agent to receive compensation through Century 21 Beggins Enterprises. So Century 21 Beggins Enterprises receives the compensation either way. So I hope that clarifies that question. Next question, if we signed an exclusive buyer brokerage agreement with a buyer at 3% and seller is only offering 2.5%, and buyer cannot come up with the extra 0.5%, and we have to do a modification to the exclusive buyer brokerage agreement down to 2.5% to get the deal done. When does this modification have to be signed? Before or after contract is signed? When does it have to be signed? There's no regulation that says it has to be signed at any specific time. As far as rights and obligations, if I was the buyer, I would want the agreement signed prior to executing the purchase and sale contract, because as a buyer, I might be a little skeptical that I have an agreement that's out there that obligates me to pay 3% to my buyer agent, yet I'm signing a contract where the seller is offering 2.5%. If all of those forms are the only ones that ever get signed, I still owe the 0.5%. So there's no right or wrong way, but depending on the consumer and their trust factor, they may want that agreement signed first so that the rights and obligations are paying 2.5% in writing, rather than owing the 3% and hoping the agent will amend the agreement later. Of course, we're going to amend the agreement, and you should have that kind of rapport and trust built with your buyer so we can amend those. But if it's all the same, add the modification form, modification to the exclusive buyer brokerage agreement to the file. So as the buyer signs the contract, as the buyer signs the modification to the buyer brokerage agreement, everything gets signed at the same time and it makes them comfortable. So it's not a requirement that it has to be done. It's just that it should be signed, and to make everybody comfortable, you might as well do it all at the same time. So all documents are executed on the same date, same time, showing that very clearly this agreement was made to reduce it to 2.5% for this contract. And here's what I would do. We can modify it and we can put in additional terms. This modification is for this specific property. Only this one that we're going under contract for, because if the next one offers 3%, you want to still be able to obtain 3%. So I hope that clarifies that. Number 3, I do the residences open house opportunities every weekend. What is required of my customers that say they are working with a realtor? Well, if you have a person visiting an open house, first off, open houses do not trigger the obligation of working with a consumer or a consumer working with a realtor. So if a consumer visits an open house, they do not need to sign any type of buyer representation agreement with you, the person holding the open house, or if an agent happens to come with them, they don't need to present their buyer brokerage agreement to you if they come with an agent. A buyer brokerage agreement, an exclusive buyer brokerage agreement, a buyer representation agreement, whatever they have signed with their consumer, if they say they're working with an agent, that contract is between the buyer's agent and the buyer. The same way our listing contract is between the seller and the seller's agent, seller's brokerage, right? So when we see those two scenarios, we are under no obligation to ever share our listing agreement with anybody. So a buyer's agent is under no obligation to provide anything to you to show them or prove to you that they are working with another realtor. In fact, if they have an exclusive buyer brokerage agreement signed with a buyer's agent and brokerage, that form, if they use the FAR form, the Florida Association of Realtors form, says that they will notify every other agent or brokerage or seller that they are exclusively represented by another brokerage. It says they will notify them. It doesn't say they'll give them the form. It says they will notify them they're exclusively represented. That's part of their obligations. That's the really cool part about the exclusive buyer brokerage agreement, the EBBA, is that it creates more rights and more obligations for both us and the consumer. Creates a more solid relationship that spells out how it's going to happen, what's going to happen, and how the process is going to go. So what's required of you, the agent holding the open house? Nothing. You are working on behalf of the seller. The seller has an agreement with Century 21 Beggins Enterprises. You are an agent of Century 21 Beggins Enterprises. You are working on behalf of the seller by holding the open house. You do not need to have a buyer representation agreement signed with any buyer that walks through the open house, as you are working on behalf of the seller to market the property, to show the property in an effort to get the property sold. So no agreements need to be signed. When agreements need to be signed is when you are deemed to be working with that buyer, meaning if that buyer decides that they want to write an offer, you would need to have some representation agreement signed with that buyer. Or that buyer would need to go to their agent, who they have an agreement signed with, and that agent would then communicate with us. Okay? That was number 3. Number 4, how do you go about this process when representing yourself as an agent on the purchase? Okay, so as an agent purchasing a property, do you need, please, let's chat, do you need a buyer representation agreement signed if you are an agent purchasing a property? Yes or no? Do we need a buyer rep agreement signed if you are an agent purchasing a property? No, no, yes, no, no. Yes, if you want to get paid. No, don't think so. No, yes. Okay, so Here's the bigger question. Do you want to get paid? If you want to get paid a buyer agent compensation, who receives the buyer agent compensation in a real estate contract in the state of Florida? Do you receive it or does the brokerage receive it? The brokerage receives it. So if the brokerage receives it, you are the buyer. You're also the authorized agent of the brokerage, but the brokerage receives compensation and then passes that on to you. So would you need a form signed if the brokerage is receiving compensation? In Florida, the brokerage receives the compensation, not you. You're an authorized agent of the brokerage, and if you want to get paid, how are you going to get paid? Because the only way you can get paid as a buyer's agent in the new world of settlement policies is if you have a signed representation agreement that clearly spells out how much you will be compensated, how much the brokerage would be compensated in that form. Correct? Do you follow that? Is there any questions or concerns about that? Would we use a non-rep disclosure and then a compensation agreement? I would just use a buyer representation agreement. Any type of exclusive buyer representation agreement, showing agreement, any type of agreement that says how much the brokerage is going to get paid. A non-rep form just says, I don't represent you. It doesn't have compensation in there. So you don't need that. I mean, how are you going to represent, how is the brokerage going to represent you? You can use a non-rep form if you'd like and do a compensation agreement, but you'll need some type of form that says how you will be compensated. So you can't have a compensation agreement between broker and buyer agent if there is no if a buyer's agent doesn't represent them and you have no form saying how much the buyer agent is going to receive. So Nick, you can have a compensation agreement between a seller and a buyer's brokerage, correct? But you as the brokerage and agent can only receive compensation up to whatever the compensation agreement says. So you would still need a separate agreement between you and the brokerage that says how much the brokerage can receive in that transaction for buyer agent compensation. If you are buying a home not in MLS and you are not receiving compensation, you are just buying it as a regular person, you must disclose you are an agent using the licensee's disclosure so that the public knows they're dealing with somebody who has more information and knowledge than they do. And then you are not required to have anything like that because you're not attempting to receive any compensation. You are just a buyer. You're not represented. You're not anything. I am the agent. I am the buyer. There's nothing in MLS. There's no compensation. I don't need to receive compensation. I need no agreement stating what the cap on my compensation is. I'm just buying this property. So, right. So you would just need a compensation agreement from each party. No, Nick, you would need an agreement that says between the buyer and the brokerage what your compensation is. How much the brokerage is allowed to receive on the buy side. The compensation agreement doesn't dictate what the buy side compensation can be. It only dictates how much the brokerage will receive from the seller side. Whether it's the seller, the listing brokerage, the compensation agreement is between seller or listing broker and the buyer's broker. That's one separate agreement. That does not dictate how much you can get paid. I can have a compensation agreement from the seller to the buyer's brokerage, which would be Century 21, that says 2%. I could have a separate agreement that says 3%. So that doesn't dictate how much the buyer agent can receive. So we would need an agreement clearly spelled out between the buyer, which would be you as the agent as well, and the brokerage that says how much the brokerage is allowed to receive on that buyer agent compensation. That gets a little dicey, but I hope that clarifies that. So in my opinion, the way that looks is if you want compensation, you need to have a signed representation form with yourself in the brokerage, stating that the brokerage is allowed to receive compensation with a transaction that you are involved in as the buyer as well. And once that happens, that's the compensation you can receive. Then you go get a compensation agreement to see if we can get the seller or the listing agent to pay that. And if they don't, then if they're not paying anything to you as an agent, you can do away with your representation agreement with yourself, the buyer. Best practices or strategies when given an opportunity to double side our listings. Okay, if you're going to double side your listing, there's a lot of Amber, well, before we move on, what if we are hosting an open house for someone outside of our brokerage? You are not working on behalf of the seller at that point. And if you are not working on behalf of the seller because you don't work for that brokerage, you would need some type of agreement signed with every buyer who walks in the door. Because the listing brokerage is allowed to work on behalf of the seller to sell the property. But you are not the listing brokerage. You do not work for the listing brokerage. So if you are there trying to market the property as an agent, you would need some type of agreement signed because you don't work for them and can't operate on their behalf. All right, so best practices strategies when double siding a listing. Okay, it's kind of really open-ended, but it's very much the same as it is now. If you have a listing and you take a listing, we are working to receive the listing side compensation. That's going to be in paragraph 8, box A. This is the listing agent compensation, 3%. Then in paragraph 10 of your listing agreement, box B says the seller authorizes us to offer X% to the buyer's agent, hopefully 3%. And if that's signed and you have a buyer who comes to you, you're the listing agent, the buyer comes to you, you have two options. You can work on behalf of the seller and not have any arrangements with that buyer, which means you get no buyer agent compensation because you would have no exclusive agreement with the buyer, no showing agreement with the buyer that spells out compensation. You can deliver a notice of no representation to that buyer. This is not what I would do, but you can do that. And if the seller is offering buyer agent compensation, you do not have a form signed with the buyer that spells out any compensation because you delivered a notice of no representation, you are not getting the buy side. So if you want to receive compensation on the buy side, first know that you will need to have a signed representation agreement with a buyer who comes to you to buy one of your listings. Okay, so a buyer comes to you to buy one of your listings. They're going to be calling saying, you're going to ask them, are you represented by another realtor, another brokerage? They say no. We give them the brief explanation. Well, here, I can work on behalf of the seller to schedule time for you to show that property. Because you're not working with an agent, I'm not working with you either. I'm going to work on behalf of the seller to try to sell the property for the seller. I'm going to open the door for you. You're going to tour the property. Notice you are touring the property, but I'm still working on behalf of the seller. The minute the buyer has interest in moving forward, we're going to have a signed representation agreement with him. So it'd be similar to an open house because you are allowed to work on behalf of the seller. The seller's needs cannot be put to a detriment if somebody calls and wants to show that property or wants to see that property and calls the agent directly. So we're allowed to work on behalf of the seller. I would try to have that discussion with them that I'm sure you're aware that things have changed over the last few months, and you will be required to sign some type of agreement to show this property with any agent that you work with. Any agent who wants to open his doors, you're going to have to sign some type of agreement with them. So those are some discussions that we'll have today when I meet you at the property. So you can meet them at the property, show them the home on behalf of the seller trying to sell the home, and have those discussions about signing a form then, depending on their interest, and build rapport while you're meeting them in person. If you weren't the listing agent, you couldn't do that. Because if you were just a buyer's agent, you couldn't go meet them at the property, tour the property, and then try to get something signed. That would technically be against the new settlement regulations. You would need to have an agreement signed before you tour the home. So there is a lot of benefit to having listings, getting listings, and being able to work on behalf of the seller. Because if you can build rapport at open houses, or if a buyer does contact you directly and build rapport with them by working on behalf of the seller to show the property for the seller, and then work into a buyer rep agreement with that buyer, that will help you to ensure more of that compensation. But then at that point, we know what the seller's offering as compensation for the buyer side, correct? Because we have the listing. And with us having the listing, paragraph 10, box B will say the seller's offering X% as buyer agent compensation. And they authorize us to disclose that and to offer that. So if we know they're offering 3%, Mr. Buyer, we're going to have to sign some form of representation agreement. This seller is offering buyer agent compensation to me in the amount of this. So we're going to execute a form that states that I'm allowed to receive that compensation. And we're going to work through that. Now, what if the buyer starts to negotiate with you? Well, if you're receiving more, I want some of that. Then you have some negotiations to do. You have discussions. If it's in your best interest, as far as the whole deal, the seller, the buyer, and everybody together, then why would we not make that deal work? You normally would only get 3% on the list side. So if you can give the buyer a credit from that and get 5% total because the seller was offering 3 list side, 3 buy side, then do it. It's the same as it is now. If somebody came to you, it's the same process. Somebody comes to you, wants to buy the home, you start negotiating, and to make the deal work, you give up 1%. We've all negotiated those commissions sometimes like that. We've all also written it into a listing agreement. If Chris Reed with Century 21 Beggins brings the buyer and represents the buyer, the total commission will be 5% instead of 6%. You do that up front a lot anyway, so that's okay. Question. There goes my farming tactics. Yeah, unfortunately. So there will be less agents representing both sides. Not necessarily. I think that my opinion is there's going to be a lot of buyers that want to go to the listing agent because they think they're going to get a better deal going to the listing agent, meaning I'm not going to have to pay buyer agent compensation because if I go to the listing agent, I don't have to pay him. So I think, but at that point, now all of a sudden we have more power as the listing agent. We can start working through those negotiations. That's why it's in our best interests to make sure that we explain all of this to a seller, really go through that, let them know what the best opportunities are for them to market the property, get the most amount of people. I'm going to have buyers that are coming to me directly. If you give me this opportunity to be able to speak on your behalf for the property, to negotiate with them, there's a lot of opportunities there. Is that the same that if they have an EBBA with another agent but called on our sign to tour while their agent is unavailable? We should be asking them. Their exclusive buyer brokerage agreement, like I said previously, says that they must disclose or will disclose to a seller, to an agent or a brokerage immediately upon talking to them that they are exclusively working with an agent. So as a listing agent, your first question should be, are you working with a realtor? If they say yes, then you tell them they need to get their agent involved. Pretty much the same way you would now. Nothing really changes except now there's more obligations. The buyer must disclose they are exclusively working with an agent or a brokerage. That's what the form says that. So once the BBA is signed, do we then become a transaction broker? We're already a transaction broker. In Florida, you are already a transaction broker. Our listing agreement is not a single agent listing agreement anymore. We've changed that to say it's a transaction broker relationship. We are transaction brokers in all of our listings. We have the ability to be a single agent with consent to transition, but they're all transaction broker relationships. So you're automatically a transaction broker. If we represent the buyer, do we need to request a compensation agreement from the listing agent if we went under contract before 8/6/2024 and closing after? You don't have to because you have the MLS offer of compensation that was in place. Commission is earned at the time of contract. At the time of contract, there was an MLS offer of compensation in place. Because that offer was in place, you are due the compensation. How do you verify that? If you printed out the MLS form and you have that written at the bottom showing the compensation still in there because it was prior to the 6th, that should suffice. My opinion, why not get a compensation agreement signed clarifying it? Because some title companies might actually ask for it, even if you give them that MLS form. So you might as well get the form signed. Many existing listings have verbiage and realtor remarks about being a single agent. Should that be removed? Nancy, no, because if your listing says you are a single agent, you signed a listing agreement at the time where we were a single agent. So whatever contract that they signed a listing agreement. That previous listing agreement, we only changed this a few months ago. You were a single agent. So you're still a single agent. That doesn't change because the contract that you signed with the seller says I am a single agent for you, so you will continue to be. You have consent to transition to a transaction broker, and it's an automatic thing. You don't need another signed form if a buyer comes directly to you. It is automatically assumed you will become a transaction broker, so you don't need, there's no difference there. How do I change the compensation percentage in an exclusive buyer brokerage agreement? What type of document should I use and what is it called? Or should I sign a new one? There is a form called the modification to the exclusive buyer brokerage agreement. Very simple. Modification to the exclusive buyer brokerage agreement. That's the form you would use to modify that. Very simply. Should I sign a new one? There are instances where you might want to sign a new one. So maybe they're buying a new construction home where there's different factors there. So if they buy, you sign a new one that says, hey, we're going in here, you're about to buy a Lennar home probably today. There's 3 of them. They're all offering 4% plus $5,000. So we're gonna execute a new exclusive buyer brokerage agreement for any Lennar home that pays that. That might be something you would like to do. Do you have a system for getting started with this new system for buyers who have been in my database for a long time? It might seem tedious and redundant to go through all those pages of data in the presentation when the buyer already understands everything except the new buyer broker details. So honestly, this is an opportunity for you to get back in touch with all of your buyers. This is an opportunity for you to pick up the phone and call all of them. Right now, what I would use, if you have a buyer in your pipeline, I'm not calling them trying to create any type of major conversation around this settlement. They probably aren't aware. So for me, right now, because interest rates are at the lowest they've been in the last 12 months, rates have dipped significantly. They're about 1% lower than they were 60 days ago and about 1% lower than they were a year ago too. So they're at the lowest they've been in 12 months. I would be calling all of my buyers with a message of value around interest rates. Did you know that interest rates dropping this 1% in the last 60 days has given you approximately $50,000 in purchasing power? Do you think it's a good idea that if we get my lender involved, why don't we talk to them again to see where your numbers are at? These numbers may have significantly changed. Rates go down, so did mortgage insurance rates. Mortgage insurance rates went down too. So they're going to save on the interest rate and they're going to save on the mortgage insurance rate. So I would be using that. And then as the buyer gets more interested and we continue to build more trust and rapport to get them back into the ball game, now we get a form signed with them. So for me, it's always about value. Be the most valuable person in the room. You'll be compensated in direct proportion to the amount of value that you provide. So if I provide value to this buyer, that might get them off the fence. That's why I love using like a down payment assistance type talk or interest rate type talk. You know, you just saved $50,000 by waiting till now. And if they start talking about that, we just talked to a lender yesterday. The FHA rate was around 5.6, 5.7, and they used about 5.7, I believe, and they used about $4,500 to buy the rate down to 4.75. So they got a 4.75 interest rate for a refi, a streamlined refi on an FHA loan for a buyer. So I would use that and call every buyer that I know. Hey, I was just talking to my lender and he was just so blown away that he was able to get somebody a rate in the 4s, 4.75%. Isn't that crazy? So I know you've been looking for a home. We've been looking for the last couple of years, but rates are at the lowest they've been in the last 12 months. They've dipped about 1% in the last 60 days. That gives you about $50,000 and more in purchasing power. Remember that home that we were looking at that seemed a little bit overpriced and seemed a little bit as a stretch in the budget? That one now isn't so much of a stretch. We're actually able to get that for $25,000 under budget according to your affordability based on what the lender's saying. Why don't we call my lender and let's get him on the phone to see if there's any more possibilities. So I would be having those conversations. That's how I would start it. That's the system I would use, and I would work towards getting something signed with them. If, for example, the home is listed at $310,000 with a 3% commission on 8/6, buyer agent Bob asks for the compensation form and it shows the above 3% compensation. On 8/10, the seller lowers the price to $300,000 and the commission to 2.5%. On 8/12, buyer agent Bob submits an offer at $300,000, which is current list price, and 3% commission per the compensation form. Is the compensation form still in effect because it is still within the 30-day term limit? Yes. The compensation agreement is a contract between the seller or seller's brokerage and the buyer's brokerage. If you have one out that says, I'm going to pay you 3% and it's good for 30 days from the date this is executed, then that's valid. So as listing agents, you need to be aware of all the the compensation agreements you've sent out. You would ask for them with the contract. If somebody sends you a contract, hey, can you provide me with the compensation agreement form that I sent you so we can verify all of the commissions and negotiate accordingly? So you would ask for that because, yes, it would still be valid for 30 days. According to the compensation agreement, it's valid for 30 days. We need a class dedicated on how to fill out all the forms. We did that last week, and we'll be doing that again a little more today. And I did that about a month ago on Wednesday, but we'll keep doing that. Multiple scenarios given to us in blank agreements so that we can practice how to fill them out. Just get the form and start practicing how to fill it out. Like create your own scenario, grab a partner, talk to them and say, hey, I'm the buyer's agent, you're the selling agent. Pick a listing on MLS and I'm going to request a compensation agreement and I'm going to fill the forms out. It's that simple. Just sit down and fill them out. In the past, we were not allowed to offer different compensations on the same deal to our seller and to any buyer agent on an accepted contract. Example, 3% to listing agent, 2.5% to selling agent. Does this hold true? So no, that doesn't hold true anymore because we, as a listing brokerage, the whole point of the settlement was they felt there was collusion, price fixing. The seller was upset they didn't get to negotiate the buyer side commission directly with the buyer or the buyer's agent. We as a listing agent or we as an industry negotiated it upfront for them and made it a standard that they could not negotiate. And we would say, no, you have to do this. That was part of the whole agreement. So one of the reasons our listing agreement now says seller to offer X% as buyer agent compensation and authorizes us to use that as marketing for that. Part of the reason we went to that is we will no longer be collecting the buyer side compensation. We don't want to play into the same thing that created an issue before. Even though we did nothing wrong, there was still a settlement over $400 million for NAR, over $80 million for Anywhere, and over, was it $60 million for Keller Williams. We did nothing wrong, yet there was a settlement for that amount because of the way that it was done. That's what people thought. So we weren't going to continue to do that. Your job is to procure a listing agent compensation in paragraph 8. Listing brokerage compensation. You're going to compensate us 3% for the list side. Makes it much easier for you. Your second job is to influence the seller that marketing your property with the buyer agent compensation is in your best interest. Because we can already see the very first thing we're getting when our listing goes on the market is calls from buyers agents asking if there's compensation being offered. And then replying to us, since there's no compensation offered, because I've seen a lot of these communications back and forth, I have to discuss that with my buyer and see if they're willing to negotiate that since we have an agreement for him to pay me. That's what's going. Now what you're seeing more steering, but from the buyer, because the buyer now has to make that decision. We've never steered people away from listings like that. We've never done that. But the buyer now has the decision to make. So you might see buyers saying that. So your job is to procure the listing compensation of 3%. That's your job. Should be much easier. You're not going after a full 6% commission. You're going after 3% commission and influencing the seller that this is the best way to market your property. Let me show you. Call up everybody else in the neighborhood right in front of the seller. Already have this information. Hey, are you offering buyer agent compensation? Yes, we're offering 2%. Hey, are you offering buyer agent compensation? Yes, we're offering 3%. Hey, are you offering buyer agent compensation? Yes, we're offering 3%. Mr. Seller, you can see I just called the 3 biggest competitors in our neighborhood. They are all offering 2.5 to 3% compensation to a buyer's agent. So if we are not offering at least that, we are going to be competing with somebody who is. And that's going to put your buyers who come to buy your property to a detriment. So we have a decision to make. And in my opinion, it is in your best interest as a seller for marketability of your property to have a buyer agent compensation being offered. Isn't that the definition of price fixing, though? Isn't what the definition of price fixing? Which part, actually? And Nick, I'll give you permission to unmute. I'm happy to, if you want to hit the button, you can go ahead and unmute and chat. What do you got?
Yeah, so the definition of price fixing, from my understanding, is polling your competitors and then matching their price, and that was the main issue of the lawsuit to begin with.
Sure. Well, we're not matching their price. We're telling them it's in your best interest from a marketing perspective. That's your competition. We weren't what their price fixing was is we were fixing the prices for our community by saying, you have to negotiate with me, the listing agent, and I'm going to fix the price of the buyer side compensation before the buyer ever got involved to make sure my community continues to make more. So that was the.
So it's a discrepancy between us dictating 3% is what it should be versus this is what they're offering. What do you think?
Correct. Exactly.
Gotcha.
We're discussing with them. If we are going to, Mr. Seller, you have a decision to make. Your competitors are offering this as a buyer agent compensation. Do you think you would be in a better position offering nothing or a worse position offering nothing?
Okay, that makes more sense. Yeah, I was concerned there because I was like, wait a minute, I don't want to pull the competitors and have an issue arise, you know?
Yeah, they removed it from MLS to avoid steering from buyers' perspectives about price fixing from a buyer perspective, buyer agent calling and saying, I'm not showing your listing because you're offering less. That wasn't happening. What I'm saying is there will be more more steering from a buyer because now a buyer has to decide if they can afford the 2 or 3% if they're not offering anything. So for us to pull the competitors, we're merely trying to get a pulse on the market so we can advise our seller how to market their property. Since we are only collecting the listing side commission, you have the ability to offer whatever you want. I'm telling you, I think it's in your best interest to offer more, but you make that decision. And here's why I think it's in your best interest.
It's basically I just wanted to make sure we were clear on who the ownership has and who has the ownership of that decision. Because I think that's going to be the part that people are going to fight on, you know?
100%. And that's why we chose box B in the listing agreement. The seller authorizes us to offer that compensation, not the seller pays us. And we took that money and now we do that. That's why we chose box B, because it clearly states it's the seller's decision to offer that and they authorize us to do so.
Perfect. Thanks, Chris.
You got it, Nick. Thank you, bud. We'll finish these questions and be done. Going back to question number 10, paragraph 4 says the compensation agreement takes place when fully executed by all parties, selling broker and buyer broker. So this locks the seller into that commission. If they want to lower the price and commission, they are screwed. Should we not be giving those out beforehand? Because then the seller represented stuff. They're not stuck. So Gwen, let's look at it from this scenario. Forget about everything that's changed. Think about the way things were before. MLS says we had a guaranteed offer of compensation of 3%, 2.5%, whatever it was to a buyer agent. When we lowered the price, we didn't adjust the commission as well. We always left that commission. We always took the price, and then whatever offer we came in at, we negotiated that price. So we're not pigeonholing the seller into a position where they lower the price and they still have a compensation agreement out there. Whenever we receive an offer as a listing agent, we should be requesting that compensation agreement to be signed by the buyer so we know exactly what we're negotiating. So even if your seller, let's say they're offering the home at $300,000 and they were offering 3%. Now they want to lower the price to 290 and they want to lower it to 2% and they want to offer 2%. The net is the same to them either way based on that offer. But if a buyer agent comes back at 290 and says, I'm offering you 290, and they don't present us any compensation agreements or anything, we are offering that 3% or the 2% at that point. So we would then send a buyer agent compensation agreement to the buyer. Here's the offer the buyer gave us. Mr. Buyer, here's our compensation agreement. They're going to say, oh, because we should have one for every single file whenever we're about to negotiate a contract, because we should know what compensation is being offered at these terms. So you'd always have the form. So if he doesn't submit the one that we signed before at the higher commission, I'm going to send one to him. Here's our current compensation agreement. Do you think he's going to say something about that? Hey, I was getting 3% before. Cool. Well, give me the one that says you're getting 3%, and we're going to negotiate the offer accordingly. We're going to raise the price then because the price and the terms have changed. So my opinion is we should focus on the price. So they're going to be floating around out there, but not really, because as a listing agent, we should be diligent. Any negotiation that we do should be including compensation agreements and contracts now. So we need to make sure that we have one for all of them. When you shop online, you can compare products side by side before you make a purchase. Exactly, Jen. That's the whole thing. You're allowed to make a decision based on comparison, based on what, hey, this one's giving me a rebate if I buy it. This one is 15% off and is going to cost me less. Why should a seller or a buyer not be able to do the same thing by comparing and contrasting online? Are we allowed to write the percent of commission on the sale contract? So it's kind of loaded in a way. So as far as writing the compensation on the contract, if the seller, the listing agent, if the listing brokerage or the seller already has a compensation agreement and they give it to us prior to showing, you don't need to write it into the contract because we have an agreement in place between the listing brokerage and the buyer's brokerage, or the seller and the buyer's brokerage, that says we will receive this much compensation. So you don't need to write it in the contract because you have a separate form that's between different parties, right? So the contract is between buyer and seller. The compensation agreement is between seller and buyer's broker, or listing broker and buyer's broker, not buyer and seller. So technically, listing broker or seller should have that compensation agreement prior to, should provide that compensation agreement to you as you're presenting an offer. So you present your offer and the signed compensation agreement so that all terms can be reviewed and negotiated accordingly. As a listing agent, you should not execute a contract without knowing that there is a signed compensation agreement somewhere in place. If you've already sent them out, if you have one, and if there is not one, then there is no compensation. You don't have to put it in the contract depending on how that is. Now, let's say the seller and broker are not offering any compensation. There's no compensation being offered. That's when you would use dot loop when you're writing your offer in additional terms. You'd go to the top and hit clauses. There's a clause button there. That's where our buyer agent transaction fee is. That's where all that is. You would hit clauses. And in there, Craig has crafted verbiage that says seller to credit buyer X%, 3% of the purchase price to be used as buyer agent compensation. So if there is no compensation agreement because the seller and the listing broker are not offering it, then our only option is to put it into the contract and ask the seller to credit the buyer a certain percent of the purchase price so the buyer can use that as buyer agent compensation to pay their buyer agent. If it is in the contract and there is a compensation agreement, could that create an issue of 2 commissions to buyer brokerage? It could. Again, it depends on how it's worded. Because Amy, looking at a contract is between buyer and seller. The buyer and seller cannot dictate a third party do something. So if the contract said listing broker to pay buyer's broker 3%, The buyer and seller cannot make that agreement in the contract. The buyer and seller don't have that power to dictate a third party to pay another fourth party a certain percent. So there would be no obligation of anything to be paid because the buyer and seller don't have that power to force someone else outside of the terms of their agreement to do something. If the buyer and seller contract says seller to compensate buyer 3% of the purchase price to be used as buyer agent compensation, and there is a separate compensation agreement from the seller to the buyer's agent that's signed between the seller and the buyer's agent, yes, that could potentially create an issue. But if we're getting our 3%, why would we want to force an issue to try to take 6 when 3% is just fine for us and we're representing everybody, and we would be putting the consumer to a detriment because the seller would refuse to close and do all that. So it depends on how it's worded, but more than likely, no, there won't be any issues because the way written agreements are, they're between two parties and you can't dictate what a third party is going to do. All right. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. Happy Wednesday. Just assuming other agents with less awesome training will do that. Yes, they will do that. As a listing agent, make sure you pay attention to compensation agreements and additional terms. Also in your contract, remember there's that section, costs to be paid by the seller, and there's a blank line in there. Some agents are starting to try to be a little tricky and writing that in there. We've had agents before write in 3% of purchase price as buyer closing costs in that small line and in smaller lettering. Pay attention to that. People will start to put that in there, the compensation. So costs to be paid by the seller. Some people may put that in there. All right, happy Wednesday. We'll see you at 1 o'clock live or in the room, in person in the room or online. We'll see you then. Happy Wednesday.